Good morning, everybody. Indeed, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to Decarbonising Transport Week, the UK's official awareness week. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Thanks also to our sponsors, Trojan Energy and Mott MacDonald, for supporting our activities over the next 2 days. Also, thanks as well to all of our supporting organisations, and you can see a full list of those on our website at decarbonisingtransportweek.com. My name is Andy Walker. I'm an infrastructure journalist, and I'm going to be chairing this morning's roundtable session, which is called On Track to Net Zero, Decarbonising Rail. And we've got some really interesting industry leaders who are going to try and unravel the challenges and opportunities in decarbonising the UK's rail sector. We've got Maggie Simpson OBE, Director General of the Rail Freight Group. We have Elaine Clark, Chief Executive of the Rail Forum, and David Clarke, Technical Director of the Railway Industry Association. Without further ado, we're going to get straight into all of our panelists who are going to say a few words to begin with. Then that will be followed by a question and answer session. If you have any questions for our panelists, please post them in the questions box, which you will see in the GoToWebinar interface box. Depending on what kind of machine you're using, it'll appear differently in different places. Anyway, that's enough from me. We're going to kick things off now with some words from Maggie Simpson, who is the Director General of the Rail Freight Group. That's the representative body for rail freight in the UK. And since she joined the organisation back in 2005, she's worked to promote growth in rail freight and to support member companies in their activities. So, Maggie, over to you for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Andy, and absolute pleasure to be on this webinar this morning, talking about how we can decarbonise transport. And when I think about that in the context of my members in the rail freight sector, I tend to think of it in three parts, really. The first thing, and actually the most important thing that we can do right now, is to encourage more businesses to put their goods onto rail freight today. Because we know right now out there using rail freight is the simplest way to take carbon out of your supply chains right now. And whilst there are lots of technologies that might come in the future at scale, we're waiting for the future, and actually we can be taking action today by putting more goods onto rail freight. So we need to be really focusing our action on how to get that growth and get those businesses moving their goods across to rail. The second part to that is to think again about what we can do today to reduce the carbon emissions from rail freight itself. We are still predominantly a diesel business. So what can we do right now to improve that situation? And my members are working on lots of things that they can do in that space to become more fuel efficient, to ensure that the trains are loaded to the maximum possible level, that they're as long as they feasibly can be, and also looking at how we can make sure the way freight trains are treated on the network is the most fuel efficient it can be. So when we're stopped to let passenger trains go past, that isn't always the most fuel efficient solution. So what can we do about that to try and reduce our emissions today? And finally, the third part of that is to look to the future, to try and understand what the answer is for reaching net zero. And actually in the railways, we're quite fortunate compared to many other sectors, because the answer is really quite easy, which is more rail electrification. But of course, actually driving that through in a cost-effective way is not without its challenges. So keeping the pressure on for more electrification, but also looking at the role of things like synthetic alternative fuels as they appear, and making sure that rail can access that on those parts of the network where it can't be electrified, to make sure that we've also got that solution for meeting net zero by 2050. So those are the key things we're chasing out as an organisation, and interested to hear more from others on the panel today. Thank you.
Great stuff, Maggie, and thanks for those remarks, and thanks for keeping them brief as well, because we've got limited amount of time, and I want to get to the questions as well. Our next panelist is Elaine Clark, who's Chief Executive of the Rail Forum, which is the largest industry body for the rail sector in the UK, with almost 400 members on a national basis. Elaine is going to talk a little bit about decarbonisation of transport and rail and her thoughts on that issue. So over to you, Elaine.
Good morning, Andy, and hi to Maggie and David, who we all know each other really, really well. So Andy, I am actually going to say good evening because I'm actually on the other side of the planet, which is one of the advantages of these webinars, that you can join from wherever you happen to be. So I am actually in a different time zone to, I suspect, most of you. I'll keep my comments brief, and I'm sure that David will pick up on the electrification issue. So I'm not going to really major on that in any way. But I'll do it the opposite way around to Maggie, if I may, and talk perhaps long term and then short term in terms of our approach. So I think one of the things that we are desperately in need of in the UK is a really sensible transport strategy for the long term, and that needs to be an integrated transport strategy. Rail does not exist in isolation to everything else. We have a really important role to play as the backbone, spine of our transport network, but we don't exist in isolation. So I think we really do need that overarching transport vision and strategy for the longer term that gives us all that sort of route map, if you like, of where we're trying to get to, and electrification and other forms of, whether it's fuel efficient, hybrid fuels, etc. All of that needs to play a part in that from a rail perspective. If I then bring it right back to the here and now, as Maggie was saying earlier, there's a lot that we can be doing now, and there's a lot that we are doing. So from a supply chain perspective, there are loads and loads of innovative ideas, innovative products that are available right now and that can be developed in the short term to help drive decarbonisation further. So I think, yes, we need that really long-term strategy that we can all sort of work towards, but there's lots we can be doing right now.
Great, thanks very much for that. I'm sure we'll explore some of those issues when we get to the questions. Our next speaker is David Clarke, who's Technical Director of the Railway Industry Association, and an organisation that I'm actually quite familiar with and I'm an admirer of. That's not to say that I'm not an admirer of Maggie and Elaine's organisations either. And I'm really looking forward to hear what David has got to say about this very, very important issue. So over to you, David.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. And Elaine knows me well. I am going to talk about electrification, and I'm sure I'm going to be very consistent with what Maggie and Elaine say. The issue for rail is, unlike some other modes, rail has the proven technology in the shape of electrification and low carbon rolling stock to deliver decarbonisation by 2050. Now, I'm not knocking other modes. As Elaine says, we need to look at this holistically, and rail is only one of the transport modes. But my point is that some other modes may struggle to decarbonise, whereas we have the technology and we know how to decarbonise. The problem we have is, as Elaine highlighted, is we don't yet have the strategy. So the risk is, that we have here an industry that has the capability to decarbonise, but at the current pace is likely, well, almost certain at the current pace, to miss 2050. So my simple point is we need to accelerate as an industry, and as Maggie's alluded to, probably the main contribution that rail can actually do is, for passengers, a public transport mode, and for freight as a key part of the economy, the most useful thing we can do is actually drive modal shift. Now, obviously, part of that has been an attractive offer in terms of what we offer as a railway in terms of performance and reliability, but also increasingly it's about decarbonisation. And as we see the ESG commitments moving towards expectations that anybody working for a corporate entity, for example, is likely to have to travel by the lowest possible carbon mode, we can't afford rail to be falling behind the pace. So hence, RIA in our campaigning, we've been calling for a rolling programme of electrification, fleet orders of low carbon rolling stock, and also not commercially disadvantaging suppliers who come up with carbon reduction initiatives. Now, that's not a very snappy mouthful, but what it means is, for example, in Maggie's world, if you were to fill up, there's not an incentive, there's not a commercial reason why you would fill up a freight locomotive with an alternative fuel, because it costs more than diesel. Yet if we did fill it up with an alternative fuel, we'd reduce carbon. So, can we not try and level that out? And likewise, in the infrastructure world, we're finding members coming up with great ideas to reduce the embodied carbon of construction, but being held back because at the moment, it costs more than the conventional way of doing it. So what's needed? As Elaine said, we need a strategy. We need some decisions and some commitment. And actually, if we achieve that, we believe that the consistency of workload that would be needed to deliver electrification and a rolling stock fleet to decarbonise the industry would give the kind of impetus to the industry which would allow us to invest in the people, plant and process that increases productivity and therefore reduces cost. So there's a win-win here. And of course, all of those organizations are then employing people and putting money back into the economy and putting money back into the exchequer, frankly. So actually whilst the disadvantage for rail is certainly for electrification, unless we can solve the private finance challenge, then electrification is going to be something that the exchequer is going to have to fund. Unlike, for example, if we're all encouraged to go out and buy EVs, electric cars, we'll be funding those and the exchequer won't. So rail has a challenge there to show that we are value for money and a good use of the exchequer's money. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for that. Right, I've got a number of questions coming in, and I've also got a few questions as well up my sleeve that I want to ask people. I'm going to kick off with one that's come in on our question board, and that is, what role and importance do you place on circular and climate resistance practice as part of a decarbonised rail industry? I'm going to ask that question first to Maggie Simpson. Do you have some views on that?
Yes, I think it's this week's decarbonising. So we, the absolute focus is on carbon emissions, but of course sustainability comes in all its shapes and forms, and it's really important that as an industry we look to do everything that we can on that, and that's obviously factors such as air quality, circular economy, noise, social value, and all the aspects of sustainability. And there's a huge amount of work going on across the industry, and certainly my members, to look at that. And actually, in some areas, if you took something like biodiversity, it's actually much easier to make short-term progress than it can sometimes be on decarbonisation. So it's really important that people are looking at and chasing out all those aspects. I mean, I think on circular economy, we joke, but in rail freight, our assets are very, very long life. Locomotives and wagons, can commonly be running for 30 or 40 years, and that's far in excess of what you'd expect out of an HGV, which may have a 10 or 12-year life. So, we are pretty adept at trying to make the most out of the carbon that's gone into those assets. So yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think I'll let others comment on climate resilience, but obviously across the network at the moment, we're seeing the impact of climate change on particularly landslips. And as David said, we need a reliable offer for our members. So it's going to be imperative that the Network Rail can learn how to better maintain the assets in the face of the changes that we're seeing in the climate today.
Thanks, Maggie. Elaine, if I can just turn to you for a second. What do you see as the biggest challenges for the rail supply chain when it comes to responding to this decarbonisation agenda?
Well, I think it's probably fair to say, as I sort of alluded to and David alluded to, we're actually doing quite a lot already. So I think we shouldn't underestimate that, and I think we need to be positive about that and sort of scream loudly from the hilltops about just how much we are doing. But in terms of some of the barriers, I think, and again, David alluded to this a minute ago, which is we need clients to be prepared to buy new products, new services. But let's focus on products because it's slightly easier. we know, and David will have examples, like I've got examples of where the client has asked for new technology, has asked for a more sustainable product, but then when it actually comes to the signing on the dotted line of the contract, they've gone for either the cheaper option or the tried and tested, what they've always bought before option. And it might be a cost issue, or it might be a risk aversion issue. Ooh, actually, we know what that product's done. We've had it for 20 years, so we'll stick with it. So I think one of the biggest barriers is that whether it's cost or risk aversion to actually bringing new products onto the network. And there are a number of facets to that. Part of that is around the products approvals process. Part of it is around the testing of the ability to test new products. But I think one of the key things is that willingness of the buyers to, being blunt, put their money where their mouth is in terms of actually being prepared to buy those new products. And there are some great examples of where the railway has done that, but there's probably lots of examples where it hasn't yet. And then I said there's probably other things which get in the way around things like product approvals. So it can take a long time to get your new product approved to get it onto the railway. And sometimes clients don't know what they can actually have. None of us are experts in everything. So do you really know what's out there unless you go and have a look? That's tough too. So helping the client to understand just what the art of the possible is another key challenge.
Thanks, Elaine. I think one of the issues that certainly I'm aware of, and that is the potential sheer cost of decarbonising the rail sector. There's a couple of questions in the chat that maybe might point to a potential kind of solution in that area, and that is the conversion of the many diesel units that are still out there and are still being used, potentially by going to alternative fuels like hydrogen. I mean, how realistic is that? And I can just address this question, to David. Is this one of the ways that we can maybe assuage people's concerns about, the huge cost of decarbonising rail? Because we know that under, a future government, whichever colour of stripe it'll be, and we'll probably have one within 6 to 7 months, money will be tight. So how do we kind of get over that competing priorities, for costs?
Yeah, I mean, cost is a problem in terms of upfront costs, certainly for electrification, because you have to pay for the wires up front. Over the life cycle, actually, electrification is a cheaper way to run an intensively used railway, but you've got to have the patience in order to wait for that payback, and you have to invest up front to achieve that. Now, one approach the government could take, or decision makers could take, is actually they want to find a way to reduce the long-term running costs of the railway. And one way of doing that, one key way of doing that, is to electrify the intensively used bits of the railway, because then in the long term they become cheaper to operate. And they also improve performance. There's the so-called sparks effect, and that applies to both passengers and freight. You get greater acceleration, therefore you get more resilient timetables, etc. So electrification is undoubtedly the best technology for the long term for an intensively used railway. That's probably about 2/3 of the network. We're currently we're about 38% of the network are electrified. So it's probably about 2/3 of the network would probably justify electrification. Some colleagues of Maggie's in the freight world did an analysis last year, the Chartered Institute for Logistics and Transport, that identified, and I think from memory, it was about 800 miles of electrification, which not surprisingly is also routes that passengers would use, would result in 95% of freight being under the wires and therefore decarbonised and therefore cheaper to operate in the long term. Now, the person who asked the question is onto something, however. There are lots of interim opportunities to save, to reduce carbon. So my argument always is, if we are about saving the planet for our children and grandchildren, then actually we should be not waiting till 2049 to sort of pull a rabbit out of the hat and decarbonise the railway. We should decarbonise it as rapidly as we can. So therefore, there are things we can do in the interim, in the short term. Actually, one of the easiest is alternative fuels, and whether that's hydrogenated vegetable oil or other forms of alternative fuel. The problem with that is reliable supply. And also, as I alluded to before, it costs more than diesel. So if you're an entirely commercial operation, why would you spend more on your fuel? So, you know, there's maybe a modest subsidy there that might, you know, take the freight, or indeed the passenger industry, keep them cost neutral on fuel to start shifting to alternative fuels. There are also, as your questioner asked, technical things you can do with existing trains, but you've got to think about it holistically. If you're going to put batteries or hydrogen into existing trains, there's quite a lot of engineering involved. If it's an existing train, it's only got its remaining life left. So can you get the payback of all that engineering over the remaining life? So if you put something into a 30-year-old train and maybe life extend it to 40 years, you've got to get the payback over 10 years. That makes it quite challenging. Also, unless you're designing it from the ground up, which you're not with an existing train, sometimes that can, if you're talking about passenger trains, that can sometimes take away passenger space, and passengers are the things that pay the revenue. And the same applies to freight. Maggie will probably say that there's a sort of a quote in the freight industry that the profit's in the last wagon. So if you fill up that last wagon with batteries or hydrogen, you haven't got any profit. So you've got to think about it quite holistically. Lots and lots of things are technically possible. Whether they're commercially sound is a different question.
Maggie, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but I was struck by something that Elaine said earlier when she said that we need to shout about this kind of stuff from the rooftops. And I think it occurs to me that someone who works in kind of journalism and communications is sometimes I think we don't necessarily communicate how, you know, the potential of all of this to the general public, who often are so often kind of on the back of the industry for all kinds of reasons. Do you think we should be doing more to communicate what the industry is doing from a decarbonisation perspective? Elaine.
I was going to say, are you asking me? I think the short answer to that is yes. We're not doing enough as an industry. There's much more that we can do. I think we probably all agree that, sadly, for all sorts of reasons, much of the media coverage in the on rail at the moment, at least, is relatively negative, and there's perhaps various reasons for that. But there's some really good stories to tell. There's some really good statistics that we can use that are really simple, that people can latch onto, that when they understand how many lorries, I should say, one freight train takes off the roads. They're really, really useful statistics that we can actually use. And there's another angle as well, which I think is really important, which is from a younger generation perspective. We know that as an industry, we have an ageing workforce, and we need to attract more young people into the industry for the future. One of the attractions is the fact that we are a low carbon, mode of transport. In all honesty, if I look at my grandchildren, they're much more switched on to the sustainability agenda in the widest sense than, say, I was when I was 14, 15. Probably didn't even care, hadn't even thought about it, just didn't feature at all. Whereas my grandkids very much into that agenda, and rightly so. So it's a really good hook for attracting young people into the industry to say, look, you can be part of this, you can be part of a decarbonised transport world, and you can help us. We're not there yet, obviously, as we've all said, but you can help us all on that journey. So I think there's lots of positives that we are trying to shout about it. Sometimes that it gets drowned out in all the negative stuff that flies around from the media.
I'm glad you've said that about the attraction of young people into the industry, because I think this is something that's not just unique to the rail sector. I think there's other aspects of the infrastructure industry that's actually got that kind of challenge as well. But for me, it's a challenge that is, potentially easy to address, because you are working in an industry that is, at the cutting edge, that's high tech, and people can get involved in it and actually make a difference, almost, changing the world, really, without getting too highfalutin about it. And I just think sometimes we're a little bit shy in the infrastructure sector of actually making that point to people. I just want to come back to Maggie, and we spoke earlier about electric. How can we get more use out of electric rail freight going forward?
So I think on a lot of these things, what we're missing sometimes is a little bit of policy certainty. And I know government isn't
I'll get to that in a minute.
really good at policy certainty, but I think, if you are looking to invest in rail freight, and businesses are, investing massively in rail freight, then but a new locomotive is going to cost you somewhere between £5 and £8 million. So these are big investments with a long life ahead. So you pretty much want to know that you can use it consistently. So if you want to be putting the pantograph up and running it under the wires, you need to know two things. One, that you can afford to do that the price of the electricity that you're getting is fair compared to the price of alternative fuels. And secondly, that there's going to be enough power in the overhead lines for you to be able to use them. And thirdly, of course, they need to exist. And as David's pointed out, they don't exist everywhere. If you took this kind of locomotives that are on order at the moment, they're diesel, electric bi-mode, they may well have a battery to be deployed in terminals and yards where the locomotive pulls the train through the discharge. But that will mean that we can use electric on a wider range of routes if we've got that diesel capability to fill in the gaps that currently exist. But if we're told there isn't enough power when we do get to the wires because freight trains are heavy, or you can only put the electric up at night, or actually there aren't going to be those gaps filled in, or it's too expensive, then people won't make those investments. And that's true across the piece, that people need to be able to have certainty that they can do that. So if they make a switch to HVO, they need to know that there isn't going to be a mandate saying HVO can only be used in airlines or agriculture or somewhere else. If they're going to invest in hydrogen, they need to know it won't be being put into home heating or industrial fuels, or that supply will be there. So whilst it is very difficult, I think there are some things at the moment that where there could be a better approach to build up that investor certainty than we currently have.
Yeah, again, obviously, policy certainty is definitely key. And there are obviously going to be some concerns as we move into, I suppose, the possibility, the certainty of a change of government. It might well be the same party, it might be a different party. Is there any concern that, given the financial constraints that we keep hearing about on a whole series of issues, is there any concern that the commitment of the main political parties to decarbonisation could potentially wane somewhat on the basis of those financial constraints? Or are we so far along the road, and obviously we've got the drivers of international statutory requirements and all the rest of it, that actually, to use a really poor analogy, the train's left the station on that anyway, and we just got to get on and do it? Elaine, what's your view on that? Do you think that there's any sign that the politicians might be less enthusiastic than they ought to be on this issue?
I think there is a risk, but I suspect it's a short-term risk, because I think you're right. There's a lot of international pressure. There's a lot of, we have signed up to a number of different treaties and agreements and protocols, etc., and we don't need to go through all of the various agreements. I think from a rail-specific perspective, I think the biggest risk is where rail sits within the priorities, and David alluded to this earlier. It would be much easier for government in some respects to say, oh, well, we're all going to have electric vehicles, so we don't have to worry too much about investing in rail because we haven't got the money to do that. But actually, if you look at electric vehicles, I think the latest analysis shows that if you take the whole life cycle of electric vehicles, the embodied carbon across the whole life cycle of the electric vehicle is actually greater than a diesel car, than an unleaded petrol car. So I think we need to be really careful, not from a UK perspective, but from a global perspective. Are we investing in the right things? And I think that sometimes that knee-jerk reaction of the politicians can come up with the wrong answer. But I think that's a short-term issue, personally.
Thanks, Elaine. Dave,
Andy,
sorry, go on, Maggie. Go on.
I think there is a risk at headline level, and we've seen that with, announcements about changing dates and things like that. But actually, a lot of the things that need to be done to give that policy certainty, these aren't headline things. They're being played out now in the space where stuff is what I'd call boring, but difficult. So how do you, change the way that grid connections can be made? And actually, there's some really good work being done by government looking at the regulatory framework about how an investor gets a connection into a power network if more power is needed, which had tended to be done in the past on, first come, first served, and is now being, prioritised in different ways. And these aren't things that a Prime Minister is going to be putting in the manifesto, but they are the things that are necessary for that policy certainty. So I'm less worried about swings at the top. I mean, Elaine's right, they'll come and they'll go and they'll do that. I'm more worried that we keep the pressure on to actually now starting to unlock some of the more difficult and challenging things that stop the private sector from taking action, because ultimately the private sector investment is what will decarbonise transport.
Thanks, Maggie. If I can turn to you, David, one of the things that I think about when I think about the Railway Industry Association is some of your lobbying activity, and I know that you do a lot of work in that particular area. One, how are you keeping the politicians honest in this area? And how are you communicating as well the undoubted benefits of decarbonising rail? And indeed, for our audience, give us a snappy kind of bite-sized approach to explaining those benefits to the wider public, because I think ultimately that's what will, get the public on side, and I think they can be got on side on this agenda.
I think you're right. The public can be got on side, and we were talking about young people earlier. It's I think there's a statistics out there that says only about a third of young people are learning to drive, and so that points to a whole generation that is going to be interested in public transport, and so the challenge for us is to help politicians understand that changing need. The rail industry grew in the past 20 years by almost doubled in terms of both passenger and I think freight had a similar level of growth. We've just so an example of you ask about how we focusing our campaigning. I'm going to talk about the long term rather than the short term. So in the long term, we just recently published some independent research that we had carried out, which highlights that we can expect passenger numbers to grow by between 37% and 97% between now and 2050. So that is absolutely a huge opportunity for the public to use decarbonised transport. But in order that we're providing a satisfactory service for the public, the demand is clearly going to be there. Then we need to actually invest in order to provide that service. I think the government has set a target of 75% growth in freight as well, so a similar story in freight, and so the demand is clearly there. It is the solutions are there because the railways are well understood and proven technology, and we firmly believe that if we can get the consistency of workload, the commitment or the continuity that Maggie's been referring to, then we can actually reduce cost. We can also potentially bring in private finance because the railway is a long life asset. It has steady income, and that is ideal for private finance. And if people say it can't be done, well, if you look actually, for example, HS1 is now run privately, because it's attractive to what they call patient capital. So that was refinanced post construction and became and is now owned by a series of pension funds. So in terms of the snappy call to action, well, I'm not sure this is snappy, but the rail industry can decarbonize by 2050. We have a technical solution to do so. we can offer the travelling public a really good service. The demand is there, so let's have the strategy that Elaine referred to that helps us deliver that.
Thanks very much, David. And I just want to finish very briefly, and I'll need people to be very brief because I've got to finish in 3.5 minutes time. There's been a lot of talk about electrification, but what about, you know, where there's a potential of retrofitting units for, you know, whether it be alternative fuels, including biodiesel and hydrogen? Will we see more of that going forward in order to basically potentially lessen the load on the grid? And I'm going to have to ask people to be quick in answering that one. I'm going to kick that off with Elaine first. Will we see more of that?
There's certainly the potential for it, but we also need to recognise that we need the infrastructure to support it, particularly with hydrogen. So potential is there. In certain areas, it could be a really good move, but it's certainly not the panacea for everything.
Thanks, Elaine. Maggie, your view on that?
People will invest in this if they know they've got security of supply and they know they can get it at a price they can afford. If we can crack that, then people will make the investment.
Okay, thanks a lot. And David, your view on that?
Yes, it will. As I said before, if there's sufficient remaining life in the stock to make it worth refurbishing. Just to put a scale on that, there's nearly 1,500 diesel trains, passenger trains that is, which are at or approaching 35 years old. I would suggest you would just replace those. So that is a great opportunity to build a fleet of battery or hydrogen low carbon trains that would be new and would offer you know, a modern customer ambience. So I think it's yes, but.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks to all of our speakers for taking part in this first main session of Decarbonising Transport Week. And I think, you know, just to say, it's quite clear from listening to all of you, to Maggie, to Elaine and David, that this is an industry that's thinking seriously about its responsibilities, not only to the nation, but also to the future as well. I was particularly struck by the points that were made around the need to attract new people, new workers into the industry, especially young people. And I think, you know, that point can't be made too strongly enough, because it is an industry that's an industry of the future, particularly as it decarbonises and probably becomes even more of a future-facing industry. So again, just to thank everybody, Maggie Simpson from the Rail Freight Group, Elaine Clark from the Rail Forum, and David Clarke with an E from the Railway Industry Association. Thanks very much for taking part and for answering all of the questions so comprehensively. And just to say to our audience, you'll need to log on for our next session in Decarbonising Transport Week, which is going to be on the issue of roads. A very interesting session coming up in the course of the next 15 to 20 minutes. So just for now, it's me, Andy Walker, saying thanks very much, and thanks to our panel again.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.